Controllers and attributes. In this video, we're gonna look at all the controllers that we can find on advanced skeleton rigs and the attributes that are found on those controllers. And we're gonna look at what effect they have on the rig. So here we have one of the advanced skeleton demo characters. This is Tuna. And let's start with the main controller. So all advanced skeleton rigs will come with a main controller, which is typically a circle on the ground. And here a lot of the visibility attributes are controlled. Now the one that's very often asked for is how do I turn on the visibility for the joints? And that's going to be with the main attribute, the joint visibility attribute. Now the other visibility attributes we have here, we can go through all of them, and we'll start out with just turning them all off. And we can see here we're starting up with only the main and the root controller being visible, and we'll see that of these attributes we have the FK visibility. Turning that on will show all the FK controllers. Next we have IK visibility. Now we can see the IK controllers. Then FKIK visibility turns on the visibility of these controllers called FKIK, which essentially is the controllers where you choose between FK and IK. Then we have the aim visibility, which will be, in some cases, you'll have a aim controller for the eyes. We have the finger visibility. So you can see that is a toggle that only toggles these FK controllers that are found on the fingers. We have bend visibility. Now this current character don't come with bendy limbs, but if it does, there'll be all controls all along the arms and legs to bend the limbs, and bendy vis will turn on the visibility of those controllers. Arrow visibility, if I turn that on, you can see we get these arrows that are pointing towards PoleVectors. Next we got driving system visibility. So for the default biped, that is going to mean this default driving system of the fingers. That allows you for some handy attributes to quickly curl up and apply some shapes to the hand. And the last one we already mentioned is the joint visibility. Alright, that covers the main controller. Next, let's talk about FK controllers. So basically, by default, they are the blue controllers here. Their main intention is for rotating, but they also have their channels available for translating and scaling, should you wish to do that. Now, every controller that is able to transform, that means translate, rotate, or scale, they also have an additional controller for handy utility, and that's called the extra controller. Now the default way to access this is to first select the controller, and then on your keyboard hit the up key, and you will see over here in the name of the current selected controller, this is now called the FK extra controller. So you have two levels of control. The first one you can rotate, and then you can also rotate the level above. Alright, let's then look at some of the attributes that you are likely to find on FK controllers. And we can see if you select the shoulders, this one have one here, it's called global. What a global means? It means it will maintain its orientation according to the global space as opposed to following its parent. By default, if you were to, for example, select the chest and rotate, you can see the shoulders are following. However, if you first select the shoulder, set global to the max value of 10, and now rotate the chest, you will see that the shoulder maintains its orientation. You will typically find this on the shoulder and the head, and it is useful in animation for maintaining orientation, even though the parent rotates. Now, another attribute you could find on some FK controllers is this, bias. Now, this is most commonly found on the spine, and to show in more detail what it does, what we're going to do is select the main control, turn on joint visibility, and have a closer look at the joints, because that's going to make it easier to understand the bias attribute. So, by default, select a spine controller and rotate. You can see that the behavior is, as you rotate the controller, that rotation is distributed throughout several joints. In this case, 3 joints are evenly rotating to make up for that rotation. Now this is handy because it allows you to use a single controller and get a nice even bend. So very useful in the case of a spine. However, you might want to have some control over how the rotation of the controller are distributed to the joints. And for that, you can adjust the bias. By default, the bias value is 0, and it's taking the rotation value, dividing it by the number of bones. So if we were to rotate this 90 degrees, you can see the 3 bones are going to get 30 degrees each to make up the 90 degrees. If you adjust the bias to its max value of 10, you can see that we're now getting an alternative solution, which is a much simpler one, that all the rotation from the controller is applied 100% to that first joint and none to the others. So this can be quite handy for getting that one-to-one rotation. All right, let's set that back to its default value of 0 and look at the other attribute here, and that is in-between visibility. And essentially these joints that are helping out the rotation here are called in-between joints. And if you turn on this attribute, you will see that they also have controllers. So this allows you for a very fine control. You can use the main controller to get roughly your animation. Then you can override for each joint by turning on in-between visibility. And here you can now control the exact rotation for each one of these in-between joints. And we're going to select another FK control, the first one in the spine, which is FK root. And we can see that in addition to the attributes we have already talked about, it has one more attribute. And this is unique to the root, and it's leg lock. And leg lock, what does that mean? In order to explain leg lock, again, let's just look at the joints. This will make it easier. And let's turn the bias to 10. And we will turn off leg lock to explain why we might want it to have it on. Now we can see that rotating the first controller in the spine will also rotate the root control, which affects the legs. And with the geometry visible, we can also see it, that the rotation of the first controller in the spine affects the legs. Now that is somewhat natural because the legs are attached to the root, and the root is part of the spine. So rotating the start of the spine is going to have this effect. But however, often in animation, you might have leg animation that you're happy with. You're going to animate the spine and you don't want to modify the leg animation at all. So quite handy is this attribute then. It's called leg lock. If you set it to its max value of 10, you see that it is making sure these legs are completely unaffected, even though the first joint in the spine is in fact rotating. All right, I'll open this picker here just to have a handy way to go reset to the bind pose. And we'll move on to this controller. Now this is the HipSwinger, which technically is a FK controller, but it's somewhat unique because it is an FK controller that is operating in reverse. You can see that rotating it has the same effect as the normal FK controller that distributes the rotation throughout these in-between joints, but it goes in the reverse direction, giving you a handy way to essentially shake the rear end of the character. All right, let's move on to the root. A root controller is kind of a FK controller, but one unique thing about the root controller is that it is world oriented, meaning this has the same orientation as the default world coordinate system, unlike the default behavior of FK controllers where X is down the bone. So you can see X is always going to aim down to the child controller. Now, some animators prefer different local orientations. There are options in Advanced Skeleton that you can go in and customize any orientation that you like, but we're not going to go into that. At this point, there is a separate video for that. All right, next, let's take a look at these blue crosses. These are the FKIK controllers, and essentially, by selecting these, you can swap between FK and IK, and this also controls the visibility. And let's take a look at that. So we'll use the arm here to show this, and you can see that by default there's an attribute called FKIK blend. 0 means FK, you dial it all the way up to 10, and you're in IK. Now, by default, the auto vis attribute is on. That means that as you blend from FK to IK, the visibility of the FK controllers are going to automatically disappear, and the visibility of the IK controllers automatically appears. You can turn off this auto visibility if you wanted to, and that allows you to manually control FK and IK visibility, and you can have them both visible, which can be quite handy when if you're working on an animated transition between FK and IK. So at this point, we could even post the IK system separately, and you can see that the FK-IK blend will blend between the FK and the IK system. So being able to see both system and posting them separately allows you to, do animated blends over time, where you can do smooth transitions between the two. All right, next, let's look at the IK controller. Here's an IK controller, and here are some of the attributes that you typically find on IK controllers. And by default, it starts out with various space options, meaning what to follow. By default, it is following only main. That means if you select the main controller, it moves the entire rig. But anything below that, so if you go to root, the IK controller does not follow it. It's fixed in place. Likewise, you rotate the chest. This is fixed in place. Now you have various options here. You can turn off follow main. That means you can now move the main controller, and this has its own space, even outside of the main. Another option, you could say you want to follow root. This now allows the IK controller to follow any motion of the root. So you can see at this point, we will follow the root, but not yet the chest, because that's the next thing we're going to turn on. You see it has follow chest. We can set that to 10, and at this point, it will follow the chest. The next is going to be stretchy. And we can see by default, if you move the controller further away than the length of the limb, it tries to reach the controller, but it cannot. It is too short. So stretchy, turning that on, it will stretch the limb to reach the IK controller. Anti-pop. Anti-pop's quite handy. And that is because, let's reset the pose again and move on to the leg, because it's more easy to see the pop issue on the leg. As I move this IK controller up, at here, just a fraction of a unit moving this up and down is a lot of degree of angle changes. It's because we're operating here right near the fully stretched legs. Now this is an issue with all IKs, and there's a option here to work around it. So if you have animated walk cycle and you're finding that the leg seems to be doing a bit of popping as it is near fully straight, then the anti-pop attribute is quite handy. Let's go ahead and turn it on. I'll set it to 10. And at this point, you see it doesn't have that sudden pop anymore, because essentially it compensates by applying a little bit of stretching and a little bit of compression. So if you're having a knee popping during your animation, applying some anti-pop can help you with that. The next are going to be length. So basically, stretchy allowed you to increase the length of the arm, but in this case, it has to be straight to get that length. So what if you want the arm to be long, but not straight? Well, that's where the length attribute comes in handy. And you see there'll be a length 1 and 2. There could be more if you have multiple segments in your arm. But yeah, you can select both length 1 and 2. This allows you to make a much longer arm that is still allowed for it to be bent. Next, we have fatness. Now that is an option that lets you increase the volume of the arm. And that's just handy to have. Next, there is volume. All right, volume. here you might notice that if you change this attribute, nothing happens. And that is because this is an attribute that depends on other attributes. So volume here is related to stretchy. And to show what it means, let's turn on stretchy, move the IK, and you might notice here that as it starts to stretch, the volume compensates. So it gets longer, it also gets thinner. And that's because the default of the volume attribute is 10. If that was 0, it would no longer volume compensate in that squash and stretch way. Having it at 10, it will do it. And then again, as many of these attributes are, it is a soft limit attribute. That means when you click and drag, it has limits, but those limits can be broken by simply typing in any higher volume. So you can go ahead and type in 20, 30, you can even do 50. So now we have an extremely high volume compensation value here, and you can see the exaggerated effect. As soon as it starts getting a bit longer, it's much thinner. You could even take it to a negative value. You can say -20, which will give you the strange effect that as the limb stretches, the volume increases. All right, that covers the IK attributes on the arm. Let's move on to the leg because it does have additional attributes. Again, we'll use this reset pose function here. And we've already covered some of these on the arm. They are the same here. They allows you to follow different spaces, but there's another one here. Actually, there's a few other ones here, and they are, firstly, swivel. So the IK has a PoleVector, and let's bend it a bit to make it more clear. You can move the PoleVector target to determine the direction of the knee. There is one more way to do that, and that is swivel. So as you apply the swivel value, the PoleVector will kind of orbit around in various directions, and that's why it's called swivel. Next is roll. This is the foot roll system. As you apply the roll, it has this cycle of the heel touching, then the entire foot, then standing up on the toe, and then the toe lifting. This is quite a common setup for most character rigs, and it helps with creating walk cycles. Roll start and end angle essentially allows you to alter this effect. You can see here that as the angle increases up towards 30 degrees, and at 30, that's when it goes from pivoting here to pivoting right at the tip of the toe. You could increase that if you wanted. You say you want that to go all the way much higher before it pivots. Likewise, 60 degrees is where it takes over and rotates only from the toe. So you can customize those angles here. Rock is essentially allows you to tip from side to side. And as part of the rigging process, these pivot points would have been defined to match the shoe or the foot. Stretchy, we have already covered. Anti-pop length, this we have covered in the arm and volume. And yes, that covers it for these IK controllers. There is one more controller in the IK system that I would like to mention, and that is the PoleVector controller. By default, it is a controller that lets you just move it around and determine where this elbow is pointing at. It has an attribute to follow, or it has another attribute for lock. Let's look at those. Let's turn on follow. Now that it's set to follow, you can see that as I move the IK target, and especially rotate it, that is following along, which gives you quite a different behavior than the default behavior, which was not to follow. So good to know that you have the ability to have that to follow or not. The other thing you can have it do is lock. If we turn that on, it will lock the position of the elbow right to the locator, allowing you to pinpoint the exact location of the elbow. Useful in some cases. For example, you wanted to lean the elbow on the table and you want it to stay locked in place. You can use this lock option. All right, let's reset the pose again and look at more IK controllers, because the spine has its own IK controllers that are quite different from the arms and legs. So the underlying IK system here is a curve. It's called a spline IK. That's a curve driving the IK, unlike the arms and legs. Now, at first, it might be a bit confusing to see the red and green controllers if you're not used to them. So in the beginning, it could be useful to turn off that IK hybrid visibility attribute that you'll find. So let's do that so we can look at one thing at a time. These red controllers are essentially controlling that curve that's then controlling the joint. If you turn off the geometry, you can see that the curve is actually visible in here, which is quite useful, so you can see the behavior. Any spline IK is essentially controllers that drive a curve, and then these joints are following that curve. Very useful for spines, necks, tails, etc. And there are various attributes here. Let's go through them all. Now, the one at the end of the IK is going to have the most controllers. That's kind of the central hub for the IK, is the one at the end. That's why this has all these options, whereas the other ones have only single extra attributes. All right, so what are the attributes here? We have, first of all, some visibility attributes. So let's go through them. Let's do hybrid first. IK hybrid visibility. You turn that on, you get these green controllers. IK hybrid controllers are very useful controllers that works very simply and yet very useful. Because in a typical IK, you don't get a general way to rotate and bend the entire spine. That's usually a FKIK behavior. So these green controllers essentially are just parents of the red controllers, but with different pivots. And if you select it and rotate it, you get this nice bending spine with a single rotation. All right, let's turn off the hybrid controls for now and look at the other option here, IKCV controllers. Now that's a whole bunch of controllers, and they are called CV, short for control vertex. And remember, there's a curve running through here. This essentially gives you a controller for each point on that curve. Next, we have stiffness, and this is another attribute that you might just try to adjust this attribute by itself, and you will see no effect. And that's because it relies on other attributes. So if you move this controller to the side, then we're starting to see the effect of stiffness. And the stiffness is just applying how stiff this section of the spine should be. Could be more clear if we select the top and the bottom and adjust both those stiffness at the same time. And what you can kind of see is that applying more of the stiffness attribute is basically driving the spine towards a S curve as opposed to a straight line. Then we have stretchy, and by default the spine is set to be stretchy. Then likewise, we looked at before, you can choose the space which one of these controllers to follow. Now there are the attributes on this IK controller. Let's move on to this one. This has just one attribute. It's called follow end, and it's set to 5 out of a range from 0 to 10. So it's halfway following the end. So follow end means how much to follow this. So let's just move this to the side. You can see that's kind of halfway following. If it was set to 10, you see it's completely following the end controller. If it was set to 0, it is not at all following the end controller. It is then just following the base controller. So it is by default set to remain halfway between the top and the bottom. And that's not just for the translation, that's also rotation. So if you were to rotate this, you can see that this controller is halfway between the top and bottom. And you can, of course, control this on top of it being halfway in the middle between the top and bottom. All right, let's move on. Next control I want to show you is these guys, the yellow controllers on the fingers, and it doesn't have transforms, meaning it cannot rotate, translate, or scale itself, but it only has custom attributes. This is a driving system controller. Driving system is a advanced skeleton thing that you can basically make any kind of pose or animation on a character and then turn that entire pose or animation into a single attribute. By default on the biped template, it comes with this poses on the fingers, and you got these attributes, one for each finger, that allows you to curl the finger. You can then easily select multiple attributes and curl up the whole hand. It's got the attributes for spread and cupping the hand. Worth mentioning is that all driving systems are going to operate with soft limits as well. So we can see here, for example, spread. If you click and drag, it can go to a value of 10 and it stops. Should you ever need to go beyond it, you can animate beyond this. You simply just enter the amount straight in. So let's go to 15, 20, 30. That's going to hurt. Let's stop there. Likewise, it by default, soft limits at -5, but you can enter -10 if you wanted to. Now that pretty much covers the controllers that we find on the body on this character. If you wanted to get a similar video covering the controllers that we find on the base rigs of advanced skeleton characters, let me know in the comments below, and if some of you want to see that, we will make it. Hope you have enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.